can start? Great. All right. Welcome to Bruegel, everyone. I'm Jeremy Zettelmeier, the director of Bruegel. And we have an event today which I've been looking forward for weeks, if not months. Actually, not months because we only planned it about 4 weeks ago, but it's a really fantastic group on a really hot topic. And you're going to get something that you don't get very often, whether in Brussels or in Washington, D.C., on this topic, namely transatlantic cooperation or conflict, for that matter, which is nuance and depth, right? So this is a topic that is keeping everyone awake at night and often dealt with in a very shallow way. But the beautiful thing today is that we have a sort of transatlantic group that has not only thought deeply about this issue, but they have partly cooperated on overlapping papers on this issue. So let me introduce them. I will go in the order in which they are seating here. So to my left is Kim Clausing. She's the Eric Zolt Chair in Tax Law and Policy at UCLA. Don't worry, she's an economist. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Then we have Catherine Wolfram, who is the Cora Jane Flood Professor of Business Administration at UC Berkeley. Can I say that you're moving? Yeah, okay. She will be from the fall onwards at the Sloan School at MIT, and she actually studied at MIT. We studied together at MIT. Of course, she's much younger than I am. So but we still did overlap, and I think we just met in person for the first time after 25 years, like a week ago. So that was great. And then last of least, we have Luis Garicano, who is an old comrade in arms of mine since we worked on the Eurozone crisis together. He's, of course, famous in Brussels. He's a former very influential member of the European Parliament. He was at the London School of Economics. Before that, he is, of course, non-resident fellow at Bruegel, and he has been essentially on his return to academia for the last year, spent the last year mainly in the US, and he will land in Europe back in the fall. Okay, so this is going to be a three separate 10-minute statements followed by a discussion, and they will discuss overlapping thinking, but the basic idea is that Catherine, I think, will go first, discussing essentially laying out a framework, a motivation for why we have to worry and would have to worry about transatlantic cooperation, even if the politicians did not do nonsense. That's the point, right? And so here we disagree to some extent. My view is that if the politicians didn't do nonsense, we wouldn't have to worry all that much. The point that Catherine and Kim have brought out is a very nice framework on how different approaches to climate change could result in frictions. And then I think you will come in with the solutions, right? Kim will then explain the solutions to the basic dilemma. And finally, Luis will come in with a sort of hot new proposal for how transatlantic cooperation on climate could actually happen in an area that's sort of a little off the radar right now, which is methane emissions. And so, as I understand it, there is a PIE policy brief coming out today, and which will hopefully be followed by a Bruegel version very soon, on just that issue. So let me shut up at this point. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, German. Yes, the PIIE brief is out, so if you go to the homepage, you can find the PIIE brief. And I'm not someone who's prone to hyperbole, but I think it's reasonable to say that the issues that we're talking about today will define the future of how the world confronts climate change. We really can't all go it alone. Each country can't decide on its own how to confront climate change. So I can do them too. We can't, every country, every jurisdiction can't on its own confront climate change. We need to confront this as a global problem. And I think there are really two reasons for that. One is that climate change by its very nature is a global problem. It's a global pollutant. A unit of greenhouse gas emissions emitted anywhere affects everybody. And secondly, we all trade with one another. We're part of the global marketplace. And so one country's decision about how to confront climate change can affect how its products compete in that global marketplace. So I want to elaborate on these two issues, the very nature of the global problem and the trade. And that's what this 2x2 matrix on the slide is doing. So let's consider the columns first. And these are ways of differentiating countries in terms of the level of ambition in their policies to confront climate change. So for instance, a country on the right side would be considered low ambition, and a country on the left side of the chart would be considered high ambition. As an example, the EU is clearly a high ambition jurisdiction. The carbon pricing, the price level is quite high relative to other countries. There are other policies that the EU has adopted to confront climate change. On the right side, examples might be most of the low and middle income countries in the world. Some of them have carbon pricing, but if they do, the carbon prices are low. In many places, there aren't any climate policies. But that leads me to point out that we're using the word ambition completely descriptively and not with any normative judgment associated with it. Clearly, there are historical reasons why we think that the developed world might need to contribute more to the addressing the solution to climate change, because they've contributed more to the problem historically. Okay, but the issue is that politically, knowing that there are going to be this spectrum of countries, knowing that there are going to be some high ambition countries, some low ambition countries, it can be difficult politically to convince politicians to adopt aggressive climate change policies, because they'll say, well, these other countries aren't doing anything, they're going to free ride on us, you know, what's the point of doing it by ourselves? So that's one example of kind of a negative spillover. Because it's a global problem, there are these negative potential spillovers. There are also, though, potentially positive spillovers, in the sense that if countries adopt high taxes, high subsidies, and that spurs additional technology, that can kind of push the technologies down the learning curve. Maybe there's no learning, maybe it's just higher efficiencies or scale economies. And so that could have positive spillovers in the sense of driving down the cost of complying to all the other countries. Okay, now let's look at the rows of the table. And basically, within the set of high ambition countries, you can have countries that are achieving their emission reductions using different policies. And we think the crucial difference is whether the policies impose costs on producers or whether they reduce costs to producers. So for example, the key differentiation here that we're all thinking about is that the EU isn't entirely, but is doing some cost imposition with the emissions trading system, and the US with the Inflation Reduction Act is subsidizing clean energy as opposed to taxing dirty energy. And so the point is that we're both high ambition. If production moves from the EU to the US, we don't worry about emissions going down, but we definitely worry about competitiveness. And there's definitely been a lot of concern and discussion at the highest levels about that potential to get movement in industry from the US or from the EU to the US, given the Inflation Reduction Act. So I want to close just with some personal thoughts on the Inflation Reduction Act. So I was in the Biden administration for the first 20 months. And during the summer of 2022, I was working with colleagues, including colleagues in the EU, on the sanctions on Russia, especially specifically in the energy space. And literally, we were in Brussels when the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and you could kind of hear this visible sigh of relief from our counterparts. They'd been through the previous administration, they'd been kind of whipsawed, and were really glad to see that the US was back at the table and was doing something to confront climate change. But then they read the fine print of the Inflation Reduction Act and realized that there were things like the domestic content provisions. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are 10% and in some cases 10 percentage point adders to the investment tax credit or the production tax credit, that the tax credits for clean energy, if they are using steel or content or wind turbines manufactured in the U.S. So that's the thing that's gotten the most attention so far, is the domestic content provisions. It's also the case, though, of this row conflict. So even if those domestic content provisions weren't there, the U.S. is taking an approach of subsidizing clean energy, driving down the cost of electricity, whereas the European Union and other countries, Canada, the UK, are taking an approach of imposing costs. So I've laid out the issues. We think there are some solutions, but I will leave it to Kim and Luis to describe the solutions that we see.
Catherine. So, as Catherine noted, the key source of friction here is the diversity of approaches to addressing climate change. And so the two sets of proposals that we're going to look at, first is the one that I'll talk about, which is joint work with Chad Bown at Peterson, where we sort of assume this misalignment is going to occur, that countries are going to pursue diverse approaches to climate change, which seems a fair assumption, and then ask how might we modernize rules to better handle that diversity. But then Luis will tell us that this whole problem gets a lot easier if the diversity is lessened, right? If there's a way to push, for instance, the United States a little bit closer to the European approach, right? Everything gets a lot easier between the two of us, but also becomes a better model for the rest of the world to join on to sort of more price-based approach, which I think would be, optimal, of course. All right, so if we look at the friction between the United States and Europe that has arisen as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, so far most of the solutions to that have been either unilateral or bilateral. So Europe has at times proposed more aggressive subsidization. There's been a response with the Net Zero Industry Act and other ways of sort of thinking about how to pivot a bit their approach with respect to IRA. There's also been bilateral attempts to smooth over some of these conflicts, including with respect to electric vehicles, negotiating mini agreements that would enable Europe and others to access the full amounts of the credits under IRA. But Chad and I view these, legitimately as somewhat ad hoc and unsatisfying, right? So you don't want to kind of like do things that create friction and then turn around and like try to figure out how to deal with the friction if there were a way to sort of more routinize these sources of conflict. So what we suggest is that three big players, in particular the European Union, China, and the United States, come together in a way to resuscitate reciprocity. It's not so much that any particular issue between any pair of these countries will be easily resolved, but by putting together multiple issues and all three of these jurisdictions, you might be able to make more progress on a rules-based system. And the principles that we put forward here are first that climate change is the most important priority, and that countries will of course respond to that priority in a diverse set of ways, but because of that diversity, it's particularly important to have rules that can enable the world trading system to handle that, to handle those diverse approaches without leading to escalation, trade conflicts, trade wars, and all of the downsides that would remove the gains from trade. So we suggest these three areas are ones where relatively modest changes to WTO rules might be negotiated between those three parties, and that might be a stepping stone for the rest of the world. We're under no illusion that these three parties are all of it, right? If you look at the United States, the European Union, and China, they're all very powerful. They control 3/5 of the world economy, right? But they're only about half of emissions. In greenhouse gases, they're about 46% as a whole. With carbon, it's more like 51. But that still leaves an awful lot of countries outside of this. But the thought is this would be a starting point. Right, so let's look at the three sets of rules. First on subsidies. The WTO rules here are pretty clear that two types of subsidies are prohibited: export subsidies and those that use domestic content. We think that those are very appropriate prohibitions and that those should be reaffirmed, and countries, including the United States, that employ those tools should dismantle them. But more generally, subsidies for the green transition do seem inevitable, and so we should recognize that countries will choose to subsidize, and that therefore routine remedies by countries that might be affected by such subsidies should be expected and made, in fact, more evidence-based and more routine, such that it avoids escalation and conflict, right? And part of the way that you could make it more routine is requiring more evidence, including automatic sunsets for these remedies, and just sort of laying a clear path to respond so that countries can subsidize, but they know that when they export goods to other countries that they may face these remedies. A second set of issues concerns border measure rules. And here the real issue has been called by the EU CBAM, which has been designed very appropriately in a non-discriminatory way, such that as the allowances are phased out, the CBAM comes in. And this treats all products the same as they would be treated by European Union nations, right? They're going to face the carbon price within Europe, but if you import the good, it will also face the same carbon price. Nonetheless, despite this nice design, there have been several countries that have challenged whether this is actually protectionism in disguise, including China, who is directly challenging this, arguing in part that it violates most favored nation status because you're treating countries differently, right? Our solution to this is to greenlight these types of non-discriminatory CBAMs, but to make very clear that they need to be non-discriminatory. In other words, it's not okay if the United States is like, yeah, we want to join this club too, and we're just going to do the tariff part. We're not going to do the cost imposition part. And that's something that Catherine and I have been pushing back against for a long time, both in and outside of the administration. But the thought is that if you're going to do a CBAM, you have to treat your domestic firms similarly. But of course, this gets a lot easier if you can move towards greater policy alignment, and Luis's proposal will get to that. Finally, on export restriction rules, the WTO says at present that you can't use quantitative restrictions on exports, but it says there is an exception for essential goods. Since essential is difficult to define and potentially quite broad, we suggest that countries commit to not using this tool of export restrictions with respect to any good that is either climate related or an input into climate related products. I think this is actually a key part of the puzzle, because part of what motivates discriminatory treatment in the United States and subsidization as an approach in general is fear. Fear that other countries may prove to be unreliable partners and have extra market power with respect to some of the key inputs here. And of course, China is a very salient example here, since they control so much of input production in the transition economy. So the thought here is, if China and others commit to not using that tool of export restriction, it also makes it easier for the rest of the world to not subsidize as much and to not be discriminatory. Now, this is just a starting point. Of course, the rest of the world needs to come in. The dispute settlement system needs to be resolved. But we think this starting point would actually enable those to proceed more smoothly if these three big actors could agree. But we'll turn to Luis next for another approach, which doesn't so much assume the misalignment, but rather works toward greater alignment, which would really be ideal.
Both. It's good to be here. Good to be back in Brussels. Last time I was here, I was a member of the European Parliament, and one of the things that we were working on during this legislature and successfully working was the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Just to remind you what it was and what it is, because that's a key inspiration for what we're going to talk about today, is Europe has an emission trading scheme. As Kim very well said, there is actually a cost to emissions inside. And the problem is there is not cost to emission to the people who export to the European Union. And so this is called carbon leakage. You could just move a steel plant, for example, outside of the European Union, and then export back, and you will have, as Catherine had very well said, this exact same impact on the planet, and yet you would be losing European jobs. So we introduced this carbon border adjustment mechanism, and it was politically much easier to do than one could have imagined. It basically means that exporters from non-ETS countries who don't pay, export from non-ETS countries who don't pay a fee for their trading, don't pay for the emissions, will have to buy permits equivalent to the ETS price, or exactly the same ETS price, in order to export to the European Union. So what we're going to tell you today is inspired by these type of ideas. It's a methane border adjustment mechanism, as you will see. So just to start with the motivation, why methane, as Jeremy said, is like many people watching us probably have never heard of methane as an objective. And it's true, it's been kind of off the radar. It's a very potent greenhouse gas. It's over 20 years, it causes per ton 80 times the damage that CO2 causes for the planet. So it's very potent. Second, there is a lot of low-hanging fruit. It's actually the very simple things that can be done to deal with methane haven't been done. Just not flaring and detecting and repairing leaks is going to make a big difference. And there's even an easier, even lower hanging fruit, which is the fact that methane actually has commercial value. So many abatement investments in many places are actually negative cost. You can actually do them and make money from them. So we believe, well, thirdly, and importantly as well, many of the countries that are less careful about this are countries like Turkmenistan or Azerbaijan or Venezuela, which are not necessarily going to be swayed by Paris-like pledges. So what we say is, okay, there's now an opportunity, and Catherine Kim have been talking about how really kind of we've been diverging in approaches between the US and Europe, and the US has chosen this kind of subsidizing this carrot path, and we've been choosing the stick part, and it's been creating a lot of tension. The IRA, it's true, Catherine said it created some relief in Brussels when it was passed, but when people started to look at the fine print, they started to worry. And we say, look, there is an opportunity in the IRA dealing with methane emissions. The IRA actually says there are certain rules, and if you emit over a certain level, you're going to pay. Europe is actually working on a methane emission regulation. We say, hey, there is scope for doing something in Europe as well, together as well, for methane. And what is the idea? So the idea is, given that we are on both sides kind of working on methane, let's actually do something international. And what we propose is a methane border adjustment mechanism that would lead exporters to either do the regulations, and we told you some of the very simple low-hanging fruit that has to do with flaring, has to do with detection of leaks, etc., or face a fee. What is the specific type of fee that we are talking about, and how would it affect us? So we are thinking about a fee that would be equivalent to the U.S. Fee that is now passed already as the IRA. It would tax kind of methane content or oil and gas, just on oil and gas, not on all the agricultural side, which, as you know, as you can imagine, is politically a nightmare. It would involve we believe that because of all this low-hanging fruit, it will involve relatively low charges, below $1 a barrel and around $2 per megawatt hour of electricity, around €2 per megawatt hour of electricity, below $1 per million British thermal units. And I don't think anybody can do those conversions here, but I did them just before, so I think they're correct. So you put a charge and you get something of between, we believe, 15 to 45% reduction in methane emissions. 15% if just the exports to the European Union get kind of start to comply, and particularly only the negative cost one. So that's a lower bound, and the upper bound if, given that they are going to have to do this, the exporters to the European Union adopt these kind of technologies throughout. So once you are going to detect leaks, you will detect leaks throughout your chain. So we believe that it can be very significant and very effective at a pretty low cost. Now, your big concern as Europeans is going to be, for many of the audience watching us, is going to be, hey, how much more expensive is it going to make our gas and our oil. And we believe it is not going to be a significant. In fact, we believe it won't be a cost in the gas and oil market almost at all. On the oil market, because the fee is relatively small, because the abatement technologies are quite cheap, and because we believe that you can basically you're going to prefer to in many cases do the abatement and pay. In the gas, even more clearly, most exporters to Europe by far have are clean. So in fact, they have fees that would be. Remember, I talked about less than 1 on average. We're talking about fees which would be 2 cents, 3 cents, 5 cents, like people like Qatar, which actually do take care of this flaring and these leaks and all of that. In which case, they don't get affected by this, so of course it doesn't increase cost. There is just a very small number of countries that could get hit, such as, for example, Algeria. We believe that first because Europe is getting more and more capacity on LNG. We believe that these are not going to be the marginal ones who are going to be price setters, and that they're going to again prefer to the abatement cost, the abatement investment. But even when they don't make it, we believe that the cost will be very, very low. Now, so it's actually low-hanging fruit. It's relatively cheap. We believe we are already almost aligned, the US and Europe. I think it would be we believe it would be the easy thing for the United Emirates and for all the rest of the people leading towards the next COP to pick up, to actually try to push a policy like this, which could get, we believe, very wide-ranging agreement. As we say there, it's important proof of concept. It would show that we can use trade not kill the trade rules, but use the trade rules in favor of climate, which is something that, from a multilateral perspective, we believe is necessary. Doesn't seem. Yeah.
I have it. Great. No, fantastic, very clear, and also within time. Very grateful. So what we'll do now is I will ask you one round of questions, and then we'll open it to the floor. By the way, for those joining us online, you can ask questions on Slido as usual, and the Slido word is cooperation. Cooperation. #cooperation. Great. I'm going to pool my questions, okay? I have someone in mind for each, but I want to give you an opportunity of sort of transatlantic trade on the secondary market, if you want. So one question on the proposed remedy, which is to actually have a small plurilateral agreement between the EU, China, and the US that goes for reciprocity. So can you maybe say, I think of China being the main obstacle to WTO reform on this. Maybe I'm wrong. So if we could get China to join an EU-US-China thing, couldn't we also get them to do the WTO thing? And that might be even better than just to do the three-party thing. So that's one question. The second question is, so there are these various carbon club ideas around, and there is one which sort of gets a bad rap in Europe that is somehow came out of the Section 232 tariffs, right? Which is essentially the Biden administration saying, okay, we're going to, suspend those tariffs while we negotiate some sort of green steel arrangement. But, some people think that this would be terribly discriminatory and not a good idea. And so can you maybe discuss the potential for transatlantic clubs as a form of climate cooperation? I mean, that wouldn't deal with China, of course. In fact, it would be anti-China, that one. But still, maybe you can say something about that, because that doesn't play a big role in what you have said, but politically it seems important. And if you want to sprinkle in a little bit on what happened post-IRA between the EU and the US, sort of there's a sense that, Biden administration has tried to accommodate. We're trying to negotiate some sort of critical raw materials agreement of a kind. If you want to comment on that, that would be great too, but you don't have to. And then finally on the methane. So a couple of questions. So first, we are not used to the US taking the lead on a price-based policy, right? So it's almost embarrassing to Europe. So what's going on in Europe? Why don't we have a methane price? And of course, my suspicion is that maybe the regulations that we have are actually imply a tougher shadow price than what the US is doing it. So could anyone come in Europe actually make the opposite point to the one that you're making, namely that this would reduce our standard? And then on the, you talked about the countries that might get hurt by this and you sort of waved it away, but is this, are you waving it away because, say, compared to CO2 import content, methane import content is just not a big deal, it wouldn't hurt many countries? And, to the extent that some countries might get hurt, should we not then consider, compensating them in some form? Because that would be nice, no? I don't know whether we would do that, but we should probably. So if you can maybe say something on that. Okay, over to the three of you in whatever order you want.
Shall I start? Okay, so I think it's absolutely crucial to involve China in this. If you look at the US and the United States together, we're presently about 19% of world emissions. China is about 26. So I just don't think, even if we got the US-EU thing exactly perfect, we're still left with more than 4/5 of the world's emissions. China has played a role in the WTO in a fairly constructive way, showing up at meetings, doing things, being engaged. It's true that I think many countries are very frustrated with China, in part for being a non-market economy and therefore having embedded in its model really a lot of non-transparent forms of subsidization that are hard for the world trading system to deal with. So one could take this whole thing to the WTO and just say, let's resolve it there. But I think, in part, the United States is a little bit of an obstacle to that too, because it's not prioritizing the WTO as a forum to handle these things. But it is very much thinking about China. So the thought is, if you can get the United States, the EU, and China to be like, okay, we value cooperation on climate more than we value disliking each other, right? And here's some ways that we could step forward. I think there's something for all of the countries there. What China gets, which I think is very important that they get something, is recognition that, okay, the non-market economy model is in a way implicitly accepted, but you need to be aware that when you subsidize that other countries might remedy, right? And you need to commit to not doing the export restrictions, right? And if you can get that sort of bargain, China gets something, right? But they also get, a more deconflicted, smooth relationship with these two key parts of the world, right? And we could do the same calculus for the US and the EU. And so I think that's very important. In contrast, I don't think these clubs like the GASA, and Catherine can speak to this too, are as promising. One, the steel industry, I think is not a good industry as a model for anything, given how, at least in the United States, given our long history of protecting it with absolutely every tool at our disposal. It doesn't seem like you want that as the hold-up industry. But also just returning to the basic facts of the matter. Like, again, if you've got a club where 19% of world emissions is behaving well, you're really not addressing the global problem.
I would start by just pointing out that the original idea of the Carbon Club as proposed by Nordhaus didn't envision this conflict that we've been addressing. He envisioned everyone doing carbon pricing. Admission to the club would be based on some kind of minimum carbon price level. There's a proposal by the IMF that basically suggests a carbon club where the minimum carbon price required would vary by country, and you'd have it lower for low and middle income countries.
Which is a nice idea, no?
Yeah, no, it's a nice idea. It is, but it's very carbon price based. But something like the Carbon Club was definitely a motivation for us thinking about the MBAM. Where we are coordinating and aligned on approaches, let's figure out a way to work together and figure out a way to kind of incentivize other countries to follow suit. Yeah, as Kim said, the GASA, the green steel arrangement, is very opaque, so I'm not sure. I guess I can't comment on whether it fits the Carbon Club model yet because we don't know what it entails and what it will look like. So you also asked what happens post-IRA. I think one thing to emphasize is part of the beauty of the way the IRA was designed. The IRA, I would wager, is not going away. Even if we get a Republican in the White House in 2025, Republican-controlled Congress, most of the investment under IRA is happening in red states. So I think when push comes to shove, that the red state representatives and senators would not want to get rid of IRA. So I think we need to be thinking about IRA is here, how can we build on top of IRA? Because, I think we have climate reasons for doing that. IRA is not going to get us to the level of the U.S. commitment under Paris, so we need to be thinking about doing other things. We also, there are fiscal pressures that the U.S. is facing, so, the conditions may change, the conditions may move in a way that favors carbon pricing. Finally, on the questions about the methane, maybe I'll have a couple of quick thoughts, and then Luis can chime in. I think one difference between the U.S. and the EU is that we're a major producer of oil and gas. Part of what we're proposing, my sense is not, as you suggested, that the European Union regulations are stricter than the U.S., but let's get together and go through line item by line item and align where we can. And I think, one intuition for why this won't have impacts on prices is we think that the dirty exporters to the European Union are just not marginal, that they're inframarginal. So Algeria is a very important supplier to the European Union, but Algeria's supply has been very consistent, even though prices have have changed wildly. And so we think that if Algeria decides not to clean up, they will pay the border adjustment. It will not affect the prices that the Europeans pay. It will be paid by the Algerians. And your third point.
So here, I'm sorry, I'm still in the last century. I was being the altruist here, right? So this was not a concern for Europe. I was concerned for poorer countries that are going to be hit by this.
Yes, definitely. So one thing, I think we mentioned this in the brief, one thing you could do is collect the revenues and then ship them straight back to Algeria, hopefully directed towards cleaning up methane. Oops.
Benefit from adopting some of these policies, right? So if you can help them get to the point where they can pick up all this low-hanging fruit, I mean, a negative cost is a really lovely type of cost to bear.
Just very quick remarks on the first two things and a couple on distribution. So on China, I think we are all very worried by the path we're taking. Can we carve out things of mutual interests from this messy escalation of the relationship? I wish, and climate seems like the one to start. So fully in line with what Kim said. In terms of the climate club, I don't have much to add. I mean, obviously we all want eventually a worldwide climate club. And I don't remember if it was Catherine or Kim who was saying this in Washington when we talked about this. If, thanks to CBAM, Turkey has decided to introduce carbon pricing in order not to pay CBAM, well, that's what we want, right? So you can use these tools in order to expand the borders of good policy, which is some sort of club in some form. Okay, so now on methane. You were asking us what is rules versus prices, etc. As an economist, I am frustrated that, in the US we haven't managed, and even Europe is hard to explain why price-based approaches are always better, right? And if you put all these regulations, you have people who cannot get a mortgage because their house is not well isolated. You got people wondering if they should be eating beef or eating pork and all of that, which is just insane, right? It's like people are not able to know how much their impact is, and they're confused. And it's logical, right? They're already confused whether they should be eating more or less fat for their health. And then on top, they have to be confused about calculating their CO2 emissions. And with prices, you don't need that. On the margin, it doesn't matter because there is actually with an emission trading scheme that were to cover everything. On the margin, your choice has exact same impact on climate, whether you do one thing or the other. That is the whole point of a pricing, of a properly done pricing. So that's a much better policy, and in that sense, in methane, we should try. If the US is moving in pricing here, our role is like, hey, let's try to get the US to move in this good direction. Now, you were talking about the distributional aspects with Catherine asking us about that. So I have this table, I should have put it in the slides, I am sorry, which is the figure 2 in our brief. Which are the countries that have biggest emission intensities, that have lower hanging fruit, okay? So Venezuela has 2,000 kilos per gigajoule of methane. Okay, per gigajoule of electricity produced, you have 2 kilos. It's 2,000 grams, 2 kilos. And Turkmenistan has 1 kilo, 1,000 grams. Whereas, for example, countries like the US would have 165, and Saudi Arabia would have 46. So there is a huge variation. It's a lot of scope that we can go down. So only Venezuela and Turkmenistan are over 1,000 grams per gigajoule. Algeria is already at 300. So we're talking about a few kind of big problem cases. If you look at the total emissions, of course, the US is going to come first with 13,000 gigagrams per year, so like 30 million tons, I guess, gigograms. I mean, okay, 10 to 9 grams, 13 million tons, I think. That's, but the US already putting a policy. And then you go next, then you get Venezuela, Turkmenistan, Russia. Those are the big offenders. Now, I would imagine that these are countries that once they get this stimulus, they might make the difference. And the question is, do you want to compensate them? Do you want to feed them back? I would probably make a difference between some and others, right? So I would probably want to definitely necessarily work with Algeria, Angola, and Nigeria to reduce their emissions, and Mexico and so on, and feed back and give them technical assistance and feed them back. Maybe some others we don't need to worry as much.
Perfect. So thank you so much. Great answers. And maybe just on your point, I really hope you're right that the IRA will stick, because I think, warts and all, the world is better off with it. I read the New York Times article on the climate positions of all the Republican candidates, and they sound awful, right? With the possible exception of Chris Christie, they're all maybe not quite climate deniers, but it's close. So I really hope you're right, because when in doubt, ideology may trump rationality. That's particularly true in the Republican Party, but also, of course, in other parties as well. Okay, so let's open it. Any question? Please go ahead, sir, and identify yourself, and then we'll go around. And
well, good afternoon. My name is John McClintock, and I'm an environmental economist doing some research on climate issues. Could I backtrack to the beginning of the discussion, for which I think we all would like to thank Bruegel for organizing, and for the participants for their contributions. But in the introduction, you referred to, if I understood correctly, the nonsense of politicians. Now, you're presumably referring to the decisions and debates within the context of climate change. But could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I find that quite interesting, possibly very, very significant, to the point, pertinent. And I'd like to know more about how you feel about the debate at the political level.
okay, so this is the first time this has happened that I get a question after rather than you, but I'm sure there will be lots of others. Please go ahead. We'll pull a few, then we will take it back.
Thank you very much. My name is Jarosław Pietras. I have been for many years in the Council of the EU working, but most importantly, I have been for a while board member of Bruegel, so I feel a bit like at home here. My question has been provoked by yesterday's discussion on CBAM in WTO, because in Geneva you had a EU presentation on CBAM, and I have seen a full room of people having various views on what CBAM means. But first, maybe a small question to Luis Garicano on methane. It happens that in the EU you've got very little of production of gas and oil, whereas in the US you've got plenty of production of gas and oil. When you propose kind of a methane adjustment measure, the question is why you do not involve coal, where you also have methane emissions, and this, by chance, is produced in Europe in larger quantities. So if you exclude it, you create the impression you take everything which is where Europe is not involved, and therefore it is a bit a question of perception. My real questions are concerning the carbon border adjustment measure. And the question that I have is on two aspects. One is the question of uncertainty, and second is on complexity. Yesterday, or this week at least, the Commissioner has proposed methodology which is related to CBAM. I have read this morning text with annexes, and I can tell you I will have to read it hundreds of times to understand what is the question is that we are having a very complex system, and a complex system which is because we are addressing both companies which are trading, but also governments. For example, if you are going to take into account ambition measures by governments, it's not related to trading companies. However, they could benefit from it. So it's a both ways. But in order to take it, you have to add special rubrics and add all those things into already very heavy reporting exercise. And I can tell you, small importers will not happen. And the second issue on uncertainty, there is a huge difference between ERA and European approach. You know, in income from ETS yearly in Europe is something like 30 billion this year. The ERA provides for something like 50, 60 billion over the 80 every year of it. So it's not much difference. And we've got many other subsidies as well. So the problem is that there is a huge uncertainty. We do not know what will be the price of ETS allowance for next week, next month, next year. Will it be doubled and so on? When you prepare as a business a kind of business plan, you want to, and you go to a bank and you say, I'm going to have include cost of CO2, you don't know exactly what kind of cost you have to include. In American ERA, you've got in law says, we will have a following subsidies, which is very...
Right.
So I will finish that because I see, but I've got some more observations on CBAM.
Fair point. The lady in the center, please.
Thank you. So my name is Flavia Solazzo. I work for Environmental Defense Fund Europe, and I lead our energy transition work. So thank you very much for organizing this event. I agree with all of the things that have been said. And that's why I want to build up on what the colleague before me mentioned as questions. Because you have certainly also followed the negotiations for the EU methane regulation in the past months, and seen what the what the things that were on the table, and so I'm wondering to find a solution to this. So the regulation is very prescriptive, and so. How do you think that a measure like a methane border adjustment mechanism would link to this kind of to this kind of regulation that we are about to have? There are of course already situations or other legislation where we can where we have asked other countries to implement something. There are legal studies about that, but I'm wondering how we could link the two things without entering into something where there is either an issue or something that then doesn't work as other experiences we've had. Thank you.
Great. Back to you guys. Who wants to start? Please, Catherine.
So we debated whether to call it an MBAM or an MRBAM, because what we're proposing is a little bit different from the CBAM. What we're proposing is that countries need to adopt equivalent regulations, and if they don't, then they face the fee. So there's this kind of regulatory opt-out. And that's also the way the US regulations are structured, that the EPA has been tasked by the Inflation Reduction Act to develop regulations. If a state doesn't pass those regulations, then you pay the fee. So basically,
I see. So the EU would not actually have to
have
change
a
its
fee.
approach.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah.
Verification, and we envision that there would be sort of an international scientific panel that would state the sort of standards for measurement and verification in a way that could evolve over time, because in this particular area, measurement is improving on a month-to-month basis, and therefore you could use, for instance, satellite data and other types of information to verify that the country in question really did change their policy rather than just saying they did. So that's an important element of this too.
You were going to say about coal, maybe?
Oh, yeah. So on the coal, we wanted to zero in on areas where the US and the EU were aligned. And on the coal side, the US has not done anything. And I think the politics, if you remember who the pivotal voter was in the US Senate and where that pivotal voter, what state that pivotal voter represents and what the main output of that state is, I think you'll understand why the US hasn't done anything on coal.
West Virginia decides the world policy.
Yeah, yeah.
Wallonia killed or would have killed the Transatlantic free trade agreement.
Yes,
So
right.
it's not unique to the US.
Absolutely. Okay, so two points. One, which I mean is dear to my heart because it's kind of as the complexity of the of the CBAM mechanism. And I was also looking through the rules this morning, and my heart was sinking. I mean, it's really depressing. The point of the price-based regulation is that it's not complex. It's like, okay, I want to export 20, I buy 20 permits, hops done, right? It's like you can almost click on the mouse and do it. Of course, we wanted a price-based regulation that is also WTO compatible, which means we wanted to say, look, if you do the abatement yourself, you're not going to pay. So it's not like we're going to put a tariff on people who are exporting steel to Europe. We're going to put a tariff on people who are exporting steel to Europe who don't have some price for carbon. Now that requires that we need to know what they're doing, and two, there is a possibility of opting out or proving out of the regulation, and that kind of increases the documentation. Even then, I don't think goes as far as what you were saying, like, okay, the governments and all that. I mean, the obligations that are in the rules are the importers need to register with the authorities. They have to declare the imported goods that have embedded emissions, say how many embedded emissions, and they have to buy the certificates. I mean, a priori, it doesn't sound so bad, but I agree with you that when you look at those rules, it's just like, whoa. I mean, what you said is very true. It seems to me like for a small exporter, that's going to be, for a small importer, that's going to be a problem. Now, I didn't follow. On the other hand, I did not follow the WTO presentation yesterday, but I can tell you, like, I mean, we had discussions on this with a lot of people. We had lobbying from India, and from Japan, and from a lot of people. And there are two crucial things. I mean, Kim is the one who knows really about WTO rules, but there is the most favored nation, and there is the non-discrimination principles, and we have been, and the current regulation is completely compliant with that. You don't treat anybody differently because of who they are. You don't have a name of a country. Everybody gets treated according to the rules that you have in Europe and that applies to everybody else, given that those rules are specific to what your levels of carbon leakage of CO2 pricing you have. So I think I feel very comfortable that we worked very hard to deal with those WTO type objections, and that I think that there will be complaining, but I think at the end of the day, Europe is fine on that. On the other question, how is this going to be integrated with the EU methane regulation? I think Catherine answered exactly what I wanted to say, which is like, we don't need on top of this a pricing system. I would have preferred that it was not a methane regulation, but there was a methane market price. And if we had had this US initiative before, maybe we would have had that as in the Commission proposal. It is what it is, but we are saying, look, we're going to look at the measures and put it on top of for the people who are beyond the level. Remind me, Catherine, I always forget the numbers. What is, because of all these measures, what was the US number when it starts to hit above a certain threshold of emissions of methane?
$1,500 per ton of methane.
Above a threshold, right?
Yeah. Oh, what's the threshold? I
Yes.
don't remember.
Yeah, there was above the threshold. So we are just talking about this threshold. Sorry for I was just not remembering myself. So it is compatible with the regulation. It will be on top for the countries which are not applying equivalent measures.
Thank you. Is there another question or comment? I will answer, but I will want to make sure that I'm not taking anyone's time. Reinhilde, go quickly, please. We have perhaps 5 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm Reinhilde Veugelers, fellow here. So on finding easy solutions that would be implementable as best cases, like the methane.
I'm sorry, this is Reinhilde Vögelers from Bruegel
sorry,
and University of Leuven.
So what's recognized in the literature as really a success case was the Montreal Protocol for the CFC to deal with the ozone layer. And that had indeed trade restrictions in case countries would not really stick to the pledges that they made in terms of CFC reductions here. And the reason why it actually worked was because the chemical industry found it pretty easy to find alternative solutions to reduce this here because the technologies were available here. So the reason why it was low-hanging fruit and a success was because these technologies were available to deal with that. Now, that raises, for me, a bigger question in terms of should that also not be an area where we should go for transatlantic collaboration to make sure that we invest in R&D so that we get these technologies sufficiently developed so that industry can actually adopt them and that these kind of protocols would be lower cost.
How are they going to say no to that, Reinhilde?
Yeah, we've thought a bit about the Montreal Protocol analogy. So I think one thing we like about the MBAM proposal is that it's not relying on Venezuela and Turkmenistan agreeing to something like the Montreal Protocol. It's more, it's more a stick than hoping that they will sign up. Yeah, I think there are countries that we could wait for a while before they were willing to take steps. And so in the meantime, let's give them some economic incentives to take those steps.
And as to the technologies, I don't have a slide here, but you can see it in my Twitter thread. I put a Twitter thread last night, putting all these ideas together. There is a slide from the International Energy Agency, which says, look, here are the technologies that already exist, just simple detection of leaks, etc., and they already give you 50% reduction. So we believe that that's similar to the CFC case you were mentioning. The technology is on the table.
Yeah.
Excellent. So let me answer this gentleman's question. So what I meant, and the word nonsense was too flippant. What I meant was the following. So the basic thesis of the paper by Kim and Catherine that underlined the first 2 slides is this idea that if countries or economic blocs have different approaches to climate action, some trade conflict is inherent, right? So unless they all do roughly the same strategy, and the reason is that their exporters will get taxed or subsidized to different extents, and you have to somehow neutralize the effect of that on trade. And so the point I wanted to make was that while I agree with this, most in my view, of the conflict that came out of the IRA, and also a lot of what is in the response, in the European response to the IRA, is actually not directly related to climate objectives, but to essentially fights about jobs, right? So protectionism, economic nationalism, and maybe a little bit also economic security, which is, I think, a more justifiable motive, but it's not really a climate motive. And so my point was that if we were more disciplined on these other motives, we could actually sort of minimize the trade tensions to a very large degree, right? And then, you know, maybe the main motivation for Kim and Catherine's paper would have been gone because people wouldn't have been so upset anymore about these packages. So I'm glad they wrote the paper, right? But that was my point. Now, it's not nonsense because, of course, politicians respond to the demands of their political constituencies, but these are sort of non-climate motives. So that was the point. And of course, I think that these non-climate motives have to be taken seriously, but they require a different set, if you like, of policies or measures on top of what Kim and Catherine are proposing. So if we did everything right along those lines, I think it would be very, very good, and you know, to the extent that it really disciplines both sides, it would do the trick. But we are requiring a lot from these trade-oriented measures. You know, it would be nice to also reduce income inequality, for example, or produce a better social safety net, right? But this is not only an anti-US point, because the same, I mean, for the lack of a better word, phoniness is what you see in Europe and the reaction, right? Where something like a 40% onshoring target in the Net Zero Industrial Act is being justified through economic security or climate, when it has nothing to do with climate. I mean, it's going to be, if we onshore 40% of our clean tech in Europe, it's actually going to make it harder to reach our climate goals because it's going to be much more expensive to import, to produce ourselves compared to import. No, so they are all, you know, climate is a good thing. So once you put a climate legislation out there, everyone sort of packs their favorite pork or protectionist or special interest stuff into that legislation, and then we think, oh, you know, it's climate that's causing these trade tensions, and for the most part, it's not. So that was my point. Sorry to be so long, and it's awful that I have to close now at the same time. Any further comments from you guys? No, Luis?
No, I just on the politics. I very much agree with what Jeremy said. There is a kind of a general trend to kind of talk about the larger objective of climate and stick everything in, and we have to try to keep, I think, the eyes on the two externalities that Catherine started with, which are there is an R&D externality. We need to make sure that we're doing more R&D, and that can be for the world. And there is a cost externality, and we need to be sure that people are paying the cost of actually polluting, and that is not included. So those two things, and environmental externality. So those two things are the key, and all the rest is kind of BSing through. And I just also want to say, Jeremy mentioning that I think it wasn't mentioned at the start, but indeed the Journal of Economic Perspectives by paper is an open access by Kim and Catherine. It's really worth reading. So
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks to our speakers. Bye.